Chapter 3. Flavius Goes to School. The hour of the day Flavius hated most was the one when he started for school. In the first place, Mara came and shook him awake in the middle of the night. Surely it was the middle, for it was as dark as pitch. Then the slave came and dressed him. Except in summer, the hour was always cold. The slave's teeth would chatter as he worked, and Flavius would shiver in the dim light of little flickering lamps. It was no better when he was led out to the back garden to wash at the fountain. Then breakfast in the atrium, always so hasty that he never got enough, and after that a slave lighted the torch, and they would go out into the silent streets. But this morning Flavius did not find it so bad. There had been a fortnight's vacation after the triumph. Arafron was now well, and Flavius was to take him to school for the first time. He could picture the envious stares of the boys. All their pedagogues were old fellows tired of their jobs. No better than nursemaids were they, sitting outside the school gossiping all through the session. Well, his pedagogue was really a pedagogue, the kind of man a self-respecting boy ought to have. Hadn't those young men in the forum said he was the best prize father had brought home? Flavius and Arafron had breakfast together, and since it was so early, they fared alike. Bread sprinkled over with salt, olives, and cheese. People generally had a weak wine, but Tertia considered goat's milk better for her son. A slave waited upon them. Another slave brought the torch and books, the tablet and stylus, and gave them to Arafron. Arafron looked surprised, and hesitated an instant before he took them. He had never carried a bundle before. Together they went out into the darkness. The flame from the pine torch lit up the muddy street, and the smoke trailed backward. All his life Flavius was to associate the smell of burning pine with those trips to school. Flavius felt very important. Pedagogues led their charges by the hand through the streets, but since Arafron knew nothing of Rome, Flavius was the leader. The Mummius family lived with other aristocrats on the Palatine Hill, for this was before the time of the emperors, whose palace, a square mile in extent, would sprawl over this hill and the surrounding valley. The two picked their way down the steep street of steps to the Forum. It was necessary to cross one end of it to get into the Via Sacra, where the school stood. Here in the Forum Flavius stopped. In the gray dawn the place was deserted save for a few public slaves stepping here and there on early errands. The temple stood quiet and solemn as if they knew they housed the gods. The round temple of Vesta was most sacred of all. From the hole in the roof the smoke rose straight in the quiet air. The fire in this temple had been burning for centuries and was never allowed to go out. It represented all the hearth fires of Rome. Flavius and Arafron could look up the Forum to the temple, and Arafron pointed to the shields of Greece, his conquered land, hanging along its architrave. They could see the temple of Castor, the temple of Janus, with its doors open because there was still war somewhere, past the long colonnades and shops to the Capitoline Hill. On top of the hill, dim in the early light, stood the finest, biggest temple in Rome, which was called the Capitol. In after years, this Forum, with the many other forums, was to be the center of the world. It would be all of marble, with colonnades and marble statues everywhere, but now it was built largely of wood and stucco, or of rude heavy stone. Flavius stood there holding Arafron's hand, looking up at him. "Well," said Arafron, with a whimsical question in his voice. "This is the Roman Forum," announced Flavius. "And what do you want me to say, little Flavius?" "What can you say? It is the grandest spot in the world." "That's well spoken, little Roman," said Arafron, looking indulgently into Flavius's proud young face. "But for me, I must say something else." "What else?" "That I have seen far more beautiful places." "You must not say that, Arafron." Flavius's voice was half a command, half astonishment. "I should not have said it, little Flavius, for to you it can have no meaning. Shall we go now to school?" So they went onward and arrived with the other scholars. And if Flavius expected to create a sensation, he was not disappointed. The boys stared at Arafron. They whispered to one another. Scipio actually walked clear around Arafron, staring. Flavius was afraid Arafron would get angry. The school was an open portico, built on the outside of a public building. At this hour, when the sun still had not yet risen, it was foggy and cold, but later it would be sunny. The boys sat in easy chairs, the teacher also. The pedagogues sat on the floor at the edge of the portico, looking into the street. The teacher was a slave and received 60 sesterces a year, which was about $3. "The 12 laws first," he commanded. The boys began reciting by heart at the top of their voices. Such a din! The 12 laws had been given to Rome long ago and were as sacred as a Bible. On and on they droned. Then came arithmetic, then reading in their native Latin, then reading in Greek. As this last began, Arifron looked up with unconcealed scorn. He stood it for a while. Then, like a musician who cannot bear discord, he got up and walked down the street until he was out of hearing. At 11 the school stopped. This was the hour for dinner and siesta. But the day was cool, and all the boys went to a field east of Palatine Hill to play and exercise. Later this field was to have the great amphitheater Flavia for gladiatorial games, but now it was just a field. The pedagogues went, too, to watch the boys. First the boys ran races. Flavius was good in this and came out first several times, until Scipio joined them. But Flavius could not beat Scipio, for he was older and his legs were longer. Then they started at the running jump. At this, Flavius was a real failure. He could attain no height in his jump, and he never landed right. Suddenly Arifron was at his side. "Look here, Flavius," he said. "That's no way to jump. You must stand so." Arifron stood in beautiful, erect relaxation. "Try it," he commanded. And Flavius, wondering, tried. "That's better, but your face looks ugly when it is stiff," Arifron went on. "Never let yourself get stiff. Never think you can't do it. Move your legs thus in your running." Arifron stepped back to the starting place. There, for a lovely moment, he stood as if measuring the distance. Then he darted forward like a bird. Like a bird swooped up into the air and alighted as if he had had no weight, nor need to touch the ground. The boys were speechless with admiration. Then they shouted their acclaim. Flavius ran to Arifron, and before he knew what he was doing he had thrown both arms around him, in a surge of delight and affectionate ownership. "Will you teach me to do it? Will you teach me?" he pleaded. And the other boys crowded. "Will you teach me? Will you teach me?" they asked, shouting together. It was all so friendly, so clean of the hatred and bloodshed of war, that suddenly the resentment and loneliness in which Arifron had been living for weeks dropped away. He laughed. Flavius had heard him laugh like that only once before. "Yes, yes, I'll teach you all, but it will take work and practice every day." On the way home after school, Flavius said thoughtfully, "I suppose you were a professional athlete?" Arifron's face flushed with anger. "Indeed I was not. Every Greek does such things daily. He wouldn't consider himself a man if he didn't." At home, Mummius was awaiting his son in the atrium. "Come," he said, "tell me what you learned today." In awed obedience, Flavius recited the laws, making only a few mistakes, recited his oral arithmetic, and showed his tablet with its waxed surface on which he had written the Latin maxims with his sharp stylus. "Does he do well at school?" Mummius asked Arifron. "Your son has a bright mind and does well in his school," answered Arifron. "What is the drawback?" demanded Mummius. For he could tell by Arifron's tone that something was far from satisfactory about the pupil or the school. "It is the teacher," answered Arifron. "He is no better than a hack. He will do very well for the Latin and arithmetic, but his Greek is atrocious. It is a waste of the child's time." Now Mummius was not sure that he cared for his son to learn Greek. What was the use of any speech but Latin anyway? Yet it was the fashion. And since he himself was to have the surname Achaeus in honor of his victory over Greece, Flavius had best know the Greek language. Arifron took Flavius to a nearby portico and taught him correct Greek. "Do you speak a good Greek yourself?" "I hope so." Arifron restrained a smile. "Then you are to teach Greek to my son." In all this talk Arifron had not once addressed Mummius as master, yet he had so managed that Mummius did not notice. Thus it was that Flavius each afternoon was dismissed early from the regular class, and Arifron took him to a nearby portico and taught him correct Greek.